and this is Whisked Away. Today we're going to be talking about sourdough starters. So this is my sourdough starter I use often. This is Lady Joanna, and I have another sourdough starter in my fridge. Really, it's my discard, but discard is starter, starters discard. But that's your Mix-a-Lot in my fridge, which I use for like crackers and pancakes and stuff like that. This sourdough starter usually stays on my counter if I'm baking often. And I normally will feed Lady Joanna once a day. I try to do it at the same time, but really it's a starter. If you're off by an hour or two or whatever, it's totally fine. It'll be fine. But you at least want to feed it once a day if you are keeping it on your counter. If you are not going to be baking often and you don't want to have to keep feeding it, put it in your fridge, feed it once a week. That way you don't have to keep wasting all that flour. Again, if you're feeding it once a week, that's fine. You're going to feed it, let it rise, put it back in the fridge, and it'll be fine. However, if you are baking on a daily basis and want a really strong starter and really strong bread rise when you're baking your sourdough, I highly recommend keeping it on your counter, because for whatever reason, feeding it every day on your counter makes it stronger and happy, and you get better results with your bread. So these are my following tips. For sourdough starter, we are going to discard. Now, first of all, there's confusion on what discard is. Discard is basically you are taking some of your starter out and discarding it, throwing it away or putting it in another container to use for recipes. Discard is nothing more than starter. Starters discard, blah, blah, blah. So that's it. So I hope that clears it up. I know a lot of people had questions on what is discard, what can you do with discard? You can use it in all of your recipes. I highly recommend, though, if you have a healthy and happy starter and you don't want to keep a secondary in your fridge, which I recommend you do just as a backup, dehydrate some. Take some out when it's at its peak after a rise, spread it out on some parchment paper and a cookie sheet and dry it out. A thin, thin, thin layer. Once it's dried out, put it in a blender. It'll become a powder and you have a backup. You can also freeze some healthy, happy starter once it's risen and just freeze it into like ice cubes. Put it in your fridge or keep it in your freezer and you have a backup there. So if you have your dehydrated backup, you have your frozen backup, and you have some in your fridge, you are set just in case something happens to your main baby. So these are my tips. I normally eyeball my starter when I feed it, but if you're going to be using a scale, you can do a 1:1:1 ratio, meaning let's say if you have 50 grams of starter, you're going to take 50 grams of flour and then 50 grams of water. You never, ever, ever want to measure out with cups, measuring spoons, whatever, equal parts, because the weight difference, especially when it comes to the water. So when it comes to flour and starter, you might not be feeding your starter enough depending on what you have, depending on what you have for starter and what you're using for flour. So you want to make sure you feed your starter enough. Water is heavier than starter or flour. And if you're mixing in an equal part of water, it's going to become very liquidy. So you don't want it liquidy. You want it a nice, thick, pasty, thick pancake batter consistency. I actually make mine a little bit thicker, but that's what you're looking for in general. If you mix in too much water, it could separate and you might have like a false sense of hooch on top. It's not hooch, it's a separation of water and flour and starter, which is just flour and water anyway. But you don't want to do that. You want to have a nice, thick pancake batter consistency or pasty consistency. So don't use these, especially for the water. Now I eyeball mine, so I know my starter, and I usually tend to feed it either a 1:1:1 ratio, but when I need more for baking or I want to give it a nice, really good feeding, then I'll do more flour. So that's my advice. I also use a nice drop of honey, just a drop, to keep the good bacteria healthy in here and help things be nice and happy in the starter. It does not change the flavor of your starter. It just keeps the healthy bacteria and yeast in here happy. That's it. I use a mixture of rye flour and bread flour when I feed my starter. And the reason I do this is because the rye flour has really good healthy yeast and bacteria that makes your starter healthy and makes it grow. The consistency in feeding it this way is a little different though than bread flour, so it's gonna just be more grainy that way, which is fine, but it does change the flavor of your bread. Even though you're not using the rye flour to bake with, it changes the flavor of your actual sourdough bread, but it's so good. It adds a really great flavor to it. So when I feed my starter, I'm feeding with this stone ground rye that I get from Walmart. And I do this unbleached, I don't use the organic because it's expensive, but unbleached King Arthur bread flour. Now you can use all-purpose flour too, it's cheaper. It's just the bread flour has a higher protein count in it. So I'm gonna show you how I feed mine. Let's get to it. Again, you can use a scale, just make sure it's set to grams, but I don't do that. I'm definitely not using the measuring cup. We're gonna discard some of my starter. You can see I fed it yesterday and it's fallen. I use a spoon to scoop mine out, and I highly, whatever tools you're using for sourdough, I recommend you keep a wet paper towel or wet paper towels when you're either baking or feeding, and wipe them down because you do not want this stuff in your sink. You may think you don't have any problems right away, but eventually this stuff, even little bits, will add up in your plumbing. So wipe everything off and then put it in the sink. So now that I have discarded my sourdough, you see I just have a little bit in there, just enough, and that you can just use whatever's on the side even, but just a tiny bit. And now we're just going to, these are the tools I use. So I always keep a spatula, one of these Rubbermaid spatulas, and these frosting mixers or spreaders. I love these. I actually will link these in my comments and description from Amazon, because you can get a pack of these for like $7 on Amazon, and I absolutely love these. They are handy when it comes to sourdough. So right now we're just going to take this and scrape the sides down. Get everything off the edges as best you can. I'm going to go ahead and scrape that off. Down in there. And now we're going to take our rye flour. And I'm going to do about double the amount I have in there right now. And we're going to take our bread flour. We're going to pour a bit in there. Oops. Just like that. You see I have the layers here. So sourdough starter here, the rye flour here, and the bread flour there. And I'm going to be baking tomorrow, so I want extras. And now just a drop of honey. So this is just raw unfiltered honey, and just a drop. Just a drop like that. Now we're just going in with some warm water. You want to make sure this is not too hot. And I like to just do a little bit of water at a time and then stir that up. And if I need more water, I'll add more. Let's see, you want to get that nice thick pasty consistency, and just make sure all of that flour is mixed in. And again, I like mine a little bit on the thicker side. I find my starter likes to be nice and Not too dry, but kind of thick. And just stir this for a minute. Make sure you get everything. This also helps when you stir it for about a minute. This will help build up your gluten. You can see how thick and pasty this one is. This is about how I like mine. Now, if you want to go a little bit thinner, that's fine. You just don't want it really, really watered down. You want it nice and think thick, pasty pancake batter. Okay, now that we've made sure that that's mixed up for a minute and all the flour is incorporated, we're gonna go ahead and clean up my jar. So I'm just scraping this down in, getting that excess off of the spatula. This is why I keep two. And then I'm just gonna wipe this one off on the edges. Not totally clean, but enough, because what we're gonna do is now take this. You always wanna make sure your jar is nice and clean. First of all, it will keep your cleanup easier. And second of all, you wanna keep your jar clean. This prevents bad bacteria from building up. So we're just scraping that down the best that we can. This is why I use a rubber spatula. Get the edges. And what I'll do to keep my jar extra clean is take a clean, sanitized paper towel and just wipe this down. I get down in there to about the point before I know where my starter is going to rise. So if this is where it's at here, then I know my starter is going to at least double or triple. So right up here is where it should be later. So I'm going to at least clean up to that point. I'm not going to worry too much about the point where it should rise to, but above that, I want to keep my jar clean. Like that. I don't like to use a rubber band, so I'm going to use this little eyebrow pencil, lipstick pencil, maybe. So I marked it there, so I know where it's at, so I know where it's supposed to be once it's done. And we're going to come back to it in just a bit. But first, this is how I keep bad bacteria out, is I just lightly line that with a plastic cling wrap and a very loose lid, just like that. And now I let it rest. And of course, while we're waiting, you can go ahead and clean up your utensils. Again, never thought I'd go through so many paper towels, but you do not, I'd rather spend my money on paper towels than plumbing. So now we have our utensils all clean. These can go be sanitized in the sink. So now that we have our starter fed and marked, we're gonna let it wait. So we're gonna let it sit at room temperature and do its thing. So let's talk about sourdough discard. So the reason that you wanna discard your sourdough starter before feeding it is because you're trying to keep it manageable and healthy. So if you're not discarding your sourdough starter, you're gonna end up with a bunch of starter and having to add a bunch of flour and giant jars of starter all over the place, and you don't wanna do that. This keeps it manageable and it keeps your starter healthy. If you're gonna keep the starter on the counter and you're baking all the time, then definitely feed it every day, keep it on the counter. When you put it in the fridge, it does slow the growth down, and the longer it's in the fridge, the more sluggish it gets. So if you're keeping it in the refrigerator and you want to use it for baking, I suggest taking it out maybe 2 or 3 days before and do a daily feeding. Maybe even start off with like one feeding every 12 hours for the first day, and then doing a one day feeding for the other 2 days. That will get your starter back to being happy and ready to bake. And as far as your starter or your discard goes, your discard is really, it's gold, but not golden enough to have jars and jars and jars sitting around. So If you have a big family, if you're going to be baking for people all the time or cooking for people all the time, then definitely keep some discard in the fridge. For crackers, which I love, we love homemade sourdough crackers in this family. So for crackers, for pancakes, for waffles, for whatever your heart's desire, keep your discard in the fridge. But if you're not going to be cooking with it that often, and you're not going to be baking that often, but you just want to have a good sourdough bread every once in a while, throw your starter away. Throw your discard away when you're feeding it. Keep just whatever you need to bake, and keep your backup plans, and maybe a little bit of discard in your fridge, just in case. But you can always, as you're feeding it, if you feel like you want to make pancakes, you can always use that discard from your feeding that day. You don't have to keep jars and jars and jars of discard around. You are not wasting it. You are wasting it if you're not going to be using it. So if you are using, again, your sourdough starter on a daily basis for baking, your discard for cooking, great. But if you are feeding it on a daily basis or all the time, and you're not using it all the time, and you're keeping it for whatever, you're just kind of wasting your time and energy. So don't discard that often then. Just feed it when you need it. Again, if you're putting it in the fridge, take it out a few days before, do a little discard and throw it away if you're not going to use it. But don't store jars and jars and jars of it. That becomes very wasteful. So feed it whatever you need to keep it going and keep it strong, and use it when you want. But that's just me. But your sourdough discard is really gold if you're going to be using it for other recipes. So definitely keep some around. You do want to store this at room temperature, keep her warm, but you don't need to worry about it being really too warm or too cold. The colder it is, the slower it's going to rise. So even if you stick this in the fridge after feeding it, it will still rise. It's just going to take a longer time for it to rise. Do not put your sourdough starter in your oven because if you turn it on and forget about it, then it's done and it's cooked and you can't get it back, but that's what the backups are for. Microwave, same thing. You don't need to do that. Just keep her in a potentially just warm environment if you're going to need it right away or sooner than later. I also don't ever clean my jar. I don't replace my jar. I don't switch my starter out. This is its home. This is where it lives all the time. I honestly can't remember the last time I cleaned a jar. I think if I had to clean this all the time, it would drive me crazy and I wouldn't do it because starter is hard to clean up. So I found a way that works for me. I'm not saying you should do it, but I keep this in the same jar and I keep her very clean. So I wipe down all of the edges. You saw me wipe down when I was feeding with a wet paper towel. Once I'm done, I'll wipe down the edges, but I leave some room when I'm feeding where there's a little on the edges because I know it's going to rise up to that point. I'm not worried about it, but I keep my jars clean. So this has been in here for a long time. And what I do is I make sure to watch out for anything that looks pink or orange or fuzzy mold, or even comm yeast, which is like that stringy top ramen thing that grows on top. If you have any of that, you toss your starter right away and use your backup, and hopefully you have a backup. So yeah, if you find any bacteria growing on there, again, check it out for pink, orange, fuzzy mold, comm yeast, and if you have that, toss it. It's not worth trying to save it, especially the pink or the orange colors. That's really bad bacteria, so toss it. Don't scrape it off because it'll be in there even though you can't see it everywhere. So don't do it. Oops. But yeah, so I don't ever clean the jar. I just keep it in its healthy, happy home and environment, and it's been really great for me. I was cleaning my jars all the time and that drove me crazy. So I hope this helps. Also, lastly, if you're keeping it in the fridge and you're not really using it very often, and let's say your life just gets busy and you forget about it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year, you can still use it. It's dormant. It might be dormant and very sluggish and tired. you can still revive it, but it's going to take longer. The longer you let it sit in the fridge, the longer it's going to take to revive it. So a week to 10 days, I would suggest feeding it. After that, it might take a few feedings to really get it to go. And if you're storing it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever, you might find it takes a week to 2 weeks for it to start, coming back to its happy, healthy self. Now, if you need to use it and you're finding it's just not doing anything, hopefully you've set up some dehydrated starter so you can just sprinkle a little bit of that in and it'll get it to go a little bit faster. Just healthy, happy tip for me. But I hope this helps. Also, if you're storing it in your fridge, you shouldn't have hooch on your starter just sitting on the counter if you're feeding it every day. But if you have it in your refrigerator and you find that grayish black liquid that's sitting on top, that's hooch. It's not dangerous. You can actually mix that into your starter. I would just suggest draining it if you have a good amount, draining off most of it, keeping a little bit. That's going to add a nice sour flavor to your sourdough. But you can drain all of it off. It's totally up to you. You could stir all of it in. It's totally up to you, but it is not dangerous. It's not bad. It's just hooch. It's the alcohol that releases when it's just sitting in the fridge because it's hungry and needs to be fed. Also, when you're keeping it out, if you smell your starter, it'll tell you whether it's hungry or not. Sounds weird, but if you smell your starter and it smells really vinegary, alcohol-y, like very sour paint thinner nail polish smell, it is hungry. It needs to be fed. If it smells yeasty and sweet, it's still happy. I would just give it a little bit more time. So before you actually feed the starter, smell it. It's going to tell you, yeah, I need to be fed, or no, I'm still good. So you don't have to be so regimented on like feeding it at a certain point every day. It helps. But if you smell it and you notice, okay, that sour, strong scent, then it's time to feed it. But again, if it's still yeasty, then you really don't have to feed it at that point. So I hope this helps. Don't forget to like, comment, and share for more, and subscribe. And if you like sourdough recipes, check out my other recipes here. I have my recipe linked here on how I make my sourdough bread. And if you like homemade recipes from scratch, this is the place to be. Until next time, happy baking. Bye.